The name Griselda Blanco would one day be whispered with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination, but it all began in the violent, poverty-stricken slums of Medellin, Colombia. Born in 1943, her life was a masterclass in cruelty from the very start. By the age of 11, she was already a skilled pickpocket. By 13, she had allegedly committed her first murder, kidnapping and shooting a young boy from a wealthy family after a botched ransom attempt. This was not a woman who evolved into a monster. The monster was always there, waiting for an empire large enough to contain it. She fled to the United States in the early 1970s, a mother of 4, carrying not just her children but the blueprints for an unprecedented reign of terror in her mind. She settled in Queens, New York, a seemingly unremarkable immigrant. But behind the closed doors of a modest apartment, she was laying the foundation for a cocaine dynasty that would flood American streets with powder and blood. Griselda, known by the monikers the Black Widow and the Godmother, was a force of nature, short, stout, with a round face that could shift in an instant from a matronly smile to a gaze of pure, psychopathic emptiness. Her eyes, often hidden behind large tinted glasses, gave away nothing. She was flamboyant, with a taste for gaudy jewelry and designer clothes, yet she moved with the silent, predatory patience of a jungle cat. She surrounded herself with a rotating cast of hitmen, her favorite being Jorge Rivi Ayala, a loyal, cold-eyed killer who viewed her with a mix of reverence and fear. Griselda's world was one of extreme contradictions. She could be lavishly generous with her sons, buying them every luxury, then casually order the execution of a rival, a potential informant, or even one of her own men over a perceived slight. The stakes were always life and death, and the only law was her whim. By the late 1970s, she had moved her base to Miami, a city sparkling with neon and opportunity, a perfect paradise for her to poison. Miami in the late 70s and early 80s was a powder keg, and Griselda Blanco was the woman holding the lit match. The city was awash in cash and cocaine, a decadent playground where drug lords battled for supremacy in the sun-drenched streets. Griselda's operation was brutal and efficient. She pioneered the use of motorcycle assassins, the sicarios, who could pull up alongside a car at a stoplight, unleash a hail of bullets, and vanish into traffic before the victim's car had even rolled to a stop. This method became her signature. The murder rate in Dade County skyrocketed, with over 100 homicides linked directly to her cartel. The violence was not just business. For Griselda, it was personal, a sport. She was rumored to revel in the details of the killings, studying them, perfecting them. The city lived in fear, and the cops were always several steps behind, wading through a sea of shell casings and terrified witnesses who knew that speaking up was a death sentence. Then, on a sweltering afternoon in July 1979, an act of violence so brazen, so shockingly public, that it became the turning point in the war against Griselda Blanco. It happened at the Dadeland Mall, a temple of American consumerism. 2 men, German Jimenez Paneso and Jesus Chucho Castro, were leaving a liquor store, carrying bags of expensive wine. They worked for Griselda's rival. In broad daylight, 2 of Griselda's sicarios, armed with shotguns and automatic weapons, stormed the store. They didn't just shoot their targets, they executed them with a military-style assault, firing so many rounds that the walls were shredded, the bottles of liquor exploding into a sticky, alcoholic mist. The gunman then calmly walked out, got into a waiting van, and drove away, leaving a scene of absolute carnage in the middle of a crowded shopping center. The Dadeland Mall Massacre, as it became known, was a message to the entire criminal underworld and to law enforcement. There are no rules, there are no safe places. Griselda Blanco was declaring war on the world. The investigation into the Dadeland killings led detectives to the fringes of her empire, but Griselda herself remained an enigma, a ghost. The key to cracking the case wouldn't come from the streets of Miami, but from a DEA agent named Bob Palumbo. Palumbo was a new breed of narcotics agent, relentless and detail-oriented. He began to piece together the fragments of Griselda's life, chasing money trails and connecting murders that spanned states. He learned of her paranoia, her constant moving between safe houses, her habit of using multiple identities. He heard the whispers of her savage temper, of how she once shot a trusted lieutenant in the head for being 2 minutes late to a meeting. The investigation was a slow, painstaking process of building a mosaic from bloodstains and fear. They knew she was responsible for the river of cocaine and the mountain of bodies, but proving it was another matter. She was always just out of reach, insulated by layers of loyalists and the ever-present threat of death. The break finally came from an unexpected source: the bedroom. Griselda's third husband, Dario Sepulveda, whom she had married in a lavish ceremony, began to fear for his life. He had seen too much, and he knew Griselda's affection was as fickle as the Miami breeze. In 1983, he fled to Colombia with their young son, Michael. For Griselda, this wasn't just a betrayal, it was a theft. A few months later, Sepulveda was dead, gunned down in Medellin. The hit was widely believed to be her doing, a final, brutal lesson to anyone who dared to cross her. But this personal drama created a vulnerability. The constant turmoil in her personal life, combined with the escalating pressure from Palumbo's task force, was causing cracks in her organization. The walls were starting to close in. The true turning point, the moment her empire began to crumble, arrived not with a bang, but with a phone call from a jail cell. Jorge Rivi Ayala, her most trusted sicario, had been arrested on an unrelated murder charge. He was the man who knew everything, the architect of countless murders carried out in her name. Initially, he remained loyal, the stoic soldier. But facing the death penalty, Rivi made a calculation. He decided to talk. The information he provided was a torrent, a detailed confession that opened a floodgate of cold cases. He described hits in chilling, matter-of-fact detail, implicating Griselda directly in at least 3 murders. He was the star witness, a killer pointing a finger at his godmother. With Rivi's testimony, the case against Griselda transformed from a collection of circumstantial evidence into an airtight narrative of murder for hire. The DEA finally had the weapon they needed. The takedown was meticulously planned. In February 1985, acting on a tip about a drug deal, agents tracked Griselda to her home in Irvine, California. She was living under an assumed name, trying to lay low, but her taste for luxury remained. As agents stormed the house, they found her in the bedroom. There was no dramatic shootout. The godmother, the woman who had ordered hundreds of deaths, was captured without a fight. The evidence room back in Miami began to fill with exhibits, ledgers detailing multi-million-dollar transactions, flamboyant wardrobe pieces, and perhaps most chillingly, a photo album. But this was no ordinary family album. It was a collection of mugshots and surveillance photos of her rivals, each face marked with a large red X, a hit list, a personal scorecard of the dead. The courtroom drama that followed was a spectacle of its own. Griselda Blanco, now in her 40s, sat through her trial, often appearing bored, detached, a far cry from the fiery queenpin of legend. The prosecution's case was a relentless march of evidence, but its centerpiece was the disembodied voice of Rivi Ayala, played from tape recordings. His calm, monotone descriptions of murder contracts, of watching victims beg for their lives before he shot them, sent chills through the courtroom. He was the ghost in the machine. Griselda's own personal Grim Reaper come back to testify against her. The defense tried to paint him as a liar, a psychopath trying to save his own skin, but the details were too precise, the corroborating evidence too strong. The climax of the trial was not a shocking piece of new evidence, but the sheer, cumulative weight of the horror she had orchestrated. The jury saw the string of widows and orphans, the shell casings from Dadeland, and heard the cold, factual voice of her chief assassin. In 1985, the verdict came down. Guilty on all counts. Griselda Blanco was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in federal prison, plus an additional 20 years. The cocaine queen had been dethroned. But the story of Griselda Blanco does not end with the cell door clanging shut. After serving nearly 2 decades, and with Rivi Ayala's testimony somehow ruled inadmissible in a state trial, she was unexpectedly released from prison in 2004 and deported back to Colombia. She returned to Medellin, the city where her violent journey had begun, a woman in her 60s, her power and fortune gone. For 8 years, she lived a surprisingly quiet life, a ghost from a bloody past. Then, on a September afternoon in 2012, she stepped out of a butcher shop in a Medellin neighborhood. As she walked toward a waiting motorcycle, 2 assassins approached. In a grim, poetic full circle, the woman who had perfected the motorcycle hit became its victim. They fired twice, a clean, professional kill, and vanished. The Black Widow was finally dead, killed by the very methods she had introduced to the American underworld. Her legacy is not one of glamour, but of a bottomless capacity for violence that shattered countless lives and helped define an era of American crime. She was a pioneer of terror, a woman who operated with a ruthlessness that stunned even the most hardened male kingpins. She built an empire on white powder and red blood, and its foundations were the ghosts of all those she had ordered silenced. In the end, the most shocking revelation is not the scale of her crimes, but the terrifying simplicity of her nature. A human being utterly devoid of empathy for whom love and murder were simply 2 sides of the same coin. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe for more.